Hello, and welcome to Passport to the Past for Schools Growing Up in Wartime. This presentation that you're about to see is suitable for Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. The national curriculum links are History, World War II.
So we like to start by saying hello and welcome to Gloucestershire Archives, everybody. This is Gemma. I'm Kate. We both work here at Gloucestershire Archives, and I don't know how much you know about the archives, but we have documents going back over 1,000 years, all about the history of Gloucestershire. Maps, deeds, all kinds of documents written on paper and on parchment, and a lot of our material relates to what happened in the county during World War II. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Thank you very much, Kate. So, what are we going to be doing in today's session? Well, we're going to be learning about World War II. We're going to be finding out about what children did during World War II. We're going to be meeting a lady called Judy Kimber. She was a child during the war, and she's going to be telling us all about her experiences. And we'll also be suggesting some fun World War II activities. We've got a game for you to try out, a recipe, and also a letter home.
So keep calm and carry on was one of the big slogans that was used during World War II. We've added our own little or don't here because some of the things that we're going to be talking about today might be things that you find quite upsetting. Or after all, we're talking about a war, and what we know about wars is that people suffer during wartime. So it's normal to feel upset. If you need a break, just ask your teacher. And if you're still feeling upset after the session, please talk to somebody about it.
So, just before we start, I wanted to tell you about how it wasn't all about fighting. When we tend to think about wars, we tend to think about the soldiers who go abroad and fight elsewhere. But in fact, today we're going to be focusing more on what happened at home. And I just wanted to start with a couple of pictures that are very personal to me. First of all, the lady on the left, that is Teresa, and that's my nanny. And my nanny was a teenager during World War II, but it didn't stop her being an air raid warden. And what that meant was that when she was even 15 years old, she would go around when the sirens went off, when they thought there was going to be bombing by German planes. She would go off and she would make sure that people got into the air raid shelters so that they were protected. And then if you look at the other picture on the right hand side, that's my granddad Walter. Now he was a little bit older than my nanny during World War II. Now he didn't go off to war, and the reason for that is partly because he was actually deaf in both of his ears, which meant that he wasn't able to go to war. But also, before the war, he'd been in a specialised industry where he'd been making tools. And when World War II started, it was felt that my granddad would be too useful at home, and he got involved in something called radar, which became very important to being victorious during the war. So it wasn't all about fighting, and we're going to be learning particularly what it was like to be a child.
So what was World War II? Well, World War II took place between 1939 and 1945, and it was a global war, which means it involved countries from all over the world. The UK, where we live, was on the side with France, the United States, and Russia at the second half of the war after 1942, and many other countries. On the other side were Germany, Japan, and Italy and Russia up until 1942. They switched sides in 1942, plus many others. And it was still, even now, the deadliest conflict in human history. It involved lots of different types of conflict and fighting, including fighting in the skies and aircraft, the navy, the ships, on the ground warfare, and bombing of cities. The UK, where we live, wasn't invaded as such, but it was bombed from the air, and it was usually the major cities which suffered from lots of bomb raids.
So it was not all about fighting. Those who stayed at home played a vital role in the war. They included those who were too young, too old, or unfit to become soldiers. Also men doing important work like policemen and hospital workers. Women also did not fight, they weren't allowed to, but helped with planning and organising. Some men stayed at home, as I was saying about my granddad, because they were too important in war industries. This is where they made weapons, aeroplanes and radar. The UK also needed people at home to prepare for invasion. This led to the evacuation of children and mothers with babies to areas less likely to be bombed. And as we're going to be finding out, that meant generally not in the cities. And we're going to be finding out a bit more about evacuation later on. A military force at home to help protect the country should it be invaded. And citizens to take over the jobs of men who went to war, such as working on farms or in factories.
So defending the UK, the Home Guard had the nickname of Dad's Army, and that was a force that was called for by the government in the May of 1940 to defend the country should the enemy invade. So they asked for volunteers for those who had not gone abroad to fight for reasons which Gemma's already mentioned. Perhaps they weren't physically well enough, or they were too old or too young. So in Gloucestershire, 1,500 men volunteered for this force, which became known as the Home Guard. And we've got a couple of pictures from our collections here that we like very much. At the time of the photograph that you're looking at now, this was probably around about July 1940. As you can see, they've been issued with rifles, they've got guns, but they still don't have uniforms. The second picture is taken later in the war, and look at the difference. Here you can see that they've got weapons and uniforms as well, and they look a little bit more confident.
So growing food was really important during World War II. Have a little think for yourself why you think growing food was so important, and also why did they have less than before the war? Now this was for a couple of reasons. The main reason was that a lot of our food had been imported. That meant that it came from other countries, and the problem was that it tended to be brought across by boat, and those boats were bombed, so it meant that the food never got there. And the other problem was that a lot of the men who went off to war, they were the people who'd been working in the food industries, so they might have been the men working on farms and things like that. And as a consequence, it meant that there were less people around to grow the food. That did change a bit because women became much more involved and took over the jobs. But there was, for a time, a period where they had certainly less food. So Dig for Victory was an important part of fighting the war. In the UK, civilians were encouraged to turn any garden or land into the production of food. Women also took the farm jobs when men left for the war, and children even helped by tending the vegetable gardens at their homes and allotments, and they even helped with the harvest.
So as we've already said, women took over the men's jobs, and we've got 3 posters here. These are propaganda posters. We're going to talk a little bit about propaganda a bit later. And these are all encouraging women to go into roles which had always been for men up until this point. Women hadn't really gone out to work. In the majority of cases, they'd stayed home, they'd looked after the home, they'd had children and looked after their families. So the picture on the right, as you're looking at it, would that be right?
I think it's the one on the left.
On the left, as you're looking, sorry, right and left is always a problem for me, is a British propaganda poster encouraging women to come and work into the factories, to take those jobs which the men who'd gone abroad to fight were no longer able to do. And we've got another couple of examples. The one in the centre is from the United States.
Thank you, Kate. So just a little bit about rationing then. If you haven't heard about rationing, this was during the war, and even actually a few years after the war, food was rationed. This meant that you were only allowed a certain amount of food per person, and it tended to be quite a small amount. So why do you think they needed to ration food and drink? Well, it was for all those reasons that I was talking about a couple of slides ago, where I was talking about the lack of food coming into the country, and also initially the lack of people able to grow that food. So to make sure that everybody had their fair share, they said, look, what we're going to do is ration it. Everybody gets the same amount, and that makes it fair. And you can see the ration books on the right-hand side. And if you have a look, you can see what types of food and drink were rationed. Things like meat, eggs, fats, cheese, bacon, sugar. And these tended to be foods that not only people really needed in order to stay healthy, but also they were foods that perhaps there wasn't enough of. For example, sugar was mainly being brought in from the Americas. And of course, again, because of the boats being sunk, they couldn't do that. So it meant that there wasn't as much sugar around. And then other things were being made on farms, but perhaps there wasn't quite enough of it to go around. And did you know that sweets were actually rationed until 1952? So from 39 to 52. So imagine growing up in that time. Yeah, it would have been rotten, wouldn't it?
It would have been. But they probably had very good teeth,
Very, very good teeth, yes. Much better than ours.
So wartime recipes. So wartime recipes were developed to try and make rationed products go further. So the government sent out leaflets with tips about how to grow food and some recipe suggestions. And these were sometimes quite creative and designed to help the rationed food stretch further. So in these examples that we have here, these are from our collections. One of the recipes in here is creamed liver. Well, I don't fancy that very much.
Oh.
And we've got a pudding on the next slide, which was a way of trying to create a delicious pudding using very, very little sugar and very little fat.
There we go. So if you're feeling creative and fancy doing a bit of cooking for yourself, here we have the recipe for mashed potato pudding. So potatoes are one of the many things which there were quite a lot of during the war. So unlike some of the other things we were just talking about. So quite often the sort of recipes that we look at involve potatoes. If you do have a go at this recipe, please do drop us a line and let us know what it's like, because we're not too sure, are we?
We haven't tried it ourselves, have we?
No, we haven't.
And it wasn't only food and drink that were rationed. Things like fabrics and materials were rationed as well. And we've got some lovely little patterns here for creating little soft toys. And these were made out of jumpers which had been taken to pieces. So we have a camel, a kangaroo and an elephant, which somebody would have made by taking apart an existing jumper and cutting out the pieces and making a soft toy for a child who probably loved that toy, I would think.
Yeah, I think they're really lovely. I particularly like the kangaroo. There are also people to look after who came from other countries. So this photograph is from children who are German Jewish refugees who fled Germany during World War II. They arrived without parents and had to be looked after by appointed guardians. And the children that we see in the picture actually spent the whole of the war in Gloucester.
And if you think children weren't involved in the war, you'd be wrong, because during World War II, children did a lot. We know that a lot of young boys lied about their age and went to fight in the war. You weren't supposed to be able to go and fight until you were 18 years of age, but because boys believed that they were doing something brave and good for their country, we know about boys as young as 14 and 15 who lied and went to fight in the war. Other children gave up their pocket money to help with the war. The Girl Guides, the Scouts and the Sea Scouts helped with air raid, so they helped people get into the air raid shelters. They collected things like metal pans, which could be made into machinery. They gathered in food, helped with gardening and growing and with bringing in the harvest. And they encouraged adults to join the army and to stick to the rules which the government had set. And they were evacuated away from danger areas. Some children spent up to 6 years living with a family that when they started, they didn't know this family at all. Just imagine what that must have been like. So strange, young children just going to live with a family they'd never met before.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, isn't it? But we'll be hearing a little bit about this from Judy shortly. We're now going to have a closer look at our collections. We're going to show you a couple of different things. The first thing we're going to show you is an evacuation form. So on the next slide, we're going to show you a form which tells you about children who evacuated to areas considered safer for them. The homes were considered high risk for bombing by the Germans, which is why they were evacuated. And if you look carefully at the form, you will see that most of the children were actually fleeing from cities. And for some children, it was a scary and unhappy time spent away from their families. For others, moving to the countryside was wonderful, and the war was very exciting for them. They even became the best years of their life. And you were telling me earlier a little bit about your mother, weren't you, Kate?
Yeah, because my mum grew up in the East End of London, and she was evacuated in the war. She was quite little, and she went to live with a family in the countryside. It was the first time she'd ever seen food growing. She'd never seen cows before. She had much, much better food than she had at home in London. So she had things like butter and milk and stuff that, was very hard to get in London. And the family were really kind to her. And she actually told me that she was sorry to go back to her own family. So it was a really good time for her.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us, Kate. So here's a picture of that evacuation form that I wanted to show you. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this in any particular detail because, yes, you can see it's all been handwritten and it is a little bit difficult to read. But what I would say is if you can just go to the fourth column, you can see where a lot of these children were fleeing from. And you can see places like Southampton, Birmingham, Bristol, and Wolverhampton, various other places. And all of these tended to be cities and built-up areas. And what happened was that because they were cities, they often had a lot of heavy industry, things like that. It was often where they made things like in factories such as weapons and aeroplanes. And so that was where the Germans wanted to bomb. And as a consequence, sometimes some of those bombs we're going to see would unfortunately land on people's houses. So that's why children were evacuated.
So we've got an interesting photograph here from our collections, which shows some evacuated children arriving in Gloucestershire, and they're being evacuated from Birmingham, and here they are arriving at Stroud Station. This is at the start of the war in 1939. So we know that the weather in September 1939 was warm. So the people in coats and hats are the evacuees. They've got all their clothes on because they've brought everything with them. And those who haven't got coats and hats on are local people. So you can see there's a woman in the foreground here who's carrying a small child, and she's got a bag over her shoulder and a gas mask on a piece of string, as does the child behind her. There are 3 nurses in the photo. We can identify them by their caps. Several people are looking out of the train, wondering what's going on, I suppose. And there are 2 boys who've climbed up to the window so that they can see what's happening. Interesting to note that the only men in the photo are people in positions of authority. So we've got a policeman and 2 men who we think are sort of checking who's arrived on the train. Only the evacuees seem to have gas masks with them. So we think that perhaps the fear of being gassed hasn't arrived yet in Gloucestershire.
And here's another photograph of evacuees. Here we can see a police war reserve constable, so that's like a policeman, and they're helping young evacuees arriving at Gloucester railway station in 1939.
So families who took evacuees in, so families who looked after them, were paid for it. And that can still happen. So at the moment, you probably are aware that there's a war happening in Ukraine. And British families who take in families and refugees from Ukraine get some money for the government to help them meet the costs of looking after those extra people. So on this form, we can see here that this person was paid 17 shillings a week for looking after 2 evacuees. That's about £30 in today's money.
And here we have a very interesting map that's worth a close look. The Germans bombed English sites, as I was saying earlier, and their air force was known as the Luftwaffe, sorry, try and pronounce that properly. And what we can see on this map is it shows the area to be bombed, which is close to Gloucester. And the bombing area is actually lined with red, and it's Hucklecote. And we know that at the time they had heavy industry there. So probably what the Germans, the Luftwaffe, were trying to do was to bomb those particular areas. Bombing of sites was generally aimed at weapons factories and other important sites. And although schools, hospitals, and other civilian places were generally avoided, sometimes they were hit by accident.
So here we've got rather a sad picture. This is a family who've been bombed out of their house in Stoneville Street in Gloucester on the 12th of December 1940. So this is just before Christmas, and you can't see their feet, but they're wearing slippers. And probably all that they had was what they were wearing. There were some significant targets in Gloucestershire, but most of the bombers flying over were on their way to the bigger cities, to Birmingham or Bristol, or perhaps further north up to Manchester. So we know that 4,200 high explosive and 20,000 incendiary bombs were dropped on Gloucestershire, but actually the numbers of casualties are very low compared to other places. So we only had 250 people killed and 770 wounded throughout the war. And although that's terrible, of course, compared to other areas like big cities, those numbers are low. And 120 of those people were killed in one single incident at Filton Aircraft Factory, which was a big aircraft factory near Bristol. And I'm sure that would have been bombed to try and stop us being able to produce more planes.
So bomb shelters were also really important during World War II. When there were bombing raids, a siren would call out and people had to shelter in bomb shelters until the danger was over. Bomb shelters needed to be strong shelters built partly or totally underground. Cellars, mining pits, and underground tunnels, such as the London Underground, made really good bomb shelters, but in other places they actually had to be built specifically. The most common was the Anderson shelter. This was something that could be built in people's gardens, and it was named after the politician in charge at the time. And you can see the instructions on how to build them on the top right. The children that we can see in the picture, they're from Kingsholm Infant School, so near us. Notice the sandbags in the background. They're protecting a bomb shelter built for the school.
So we're going to meet our friend Judy now. Judy's going to tell us what she remembers about growing up in World War II. She was quite a small child who was evacuated. Now, we filmed this a little while ago. We had some children in the audience, and the children asked Judy some questions, and we hope that they are some of the same questions that you might like to ask. But you also might like to have a pause at the end of this and talk to your teacher about what Judy has to say. So this is Judy Kimber. Welcome, and thank you for coming today. So Judy, what's your most clear memory of that time?
Well, as far as being evacuated was concerned, I was only 2, and my baby brother, whom you saw in the photograph, was about 3 months. But because I was over 2, I had to go on a train with the school children, but my nan was allowed to go with me. And all I can really remember is that the train had blue glass windows. I suppose that might have been some sort of either strengthened glass or perhaps so that there were no lights shining out of it. And then we got to a place. I lived in Southampton, which is on the south coast of England, and we were taken further north. Because Southampton was a port, then it was subject to a lot of bombing. So we were taken further north in Hampshire to a little village called Ellisfield. And this is what my mother always told me, because I don't really remember, as I say, anything except the train. But when we got there, there was the village hall all full of women with babies and small children. And as you can imagine, there was probably quite a lot of crying going on. But my baby brother was always slept very well. And so my mum was sitting there with him, fast asleep, and I was standing with her. And then the lady of the manor came in. And because she was the most important person in the manor, she was allowed to choose who she had as her evacuees. And she stood there for a bit, and then, according to my mum, she pointed to my mother and she said, "I will have that woman with the little baby asleep and the little girl." And so we got to live in the best house in the village. It was quite a big house, actually. And there was one other family there. But that was the story my mum always told me. And we stayed there for about 3 months. And then because the bombing didn't really get serious in 1939, and because I got poorly, my mum decided to take us home to where my dad was. My dad had stayed in Southampton, and he was in what was called a reserved occupation. In other words, he was one of the people that had to stay to keep the country running. He wasn't a policeman, but he worked for post office telephones, what we call BT today. And as you can imagine, if bombs dropped, then the cables that connected telephones could get smashed, which would mean you couldn't call the police, you couldn't call ambulances, people couldn't speak to each other and all sorts of things. So it was very important that the telephones carried on operating. So that was my dad's job. And he was in the Home Guard as well, and had a nice tin hat, which my brother and I used to play with.
Did you go to your uncle's house? I remember you saying something that happened there.
Yes. When we came home first from being evacuated, we then went for a while, we stayed at home, then we went to friends of my dad's. And then when I was about 5 and the bombing was getting a bit bad in Southampton, we went outside Southampton to my uncle. It wasn't very far away. So there was me and my nan and my mum and my baby brother, who was by then about 3 and I was 5. My dad, of course, had to stay at home. And so my nan and I stayed in my uncle and aunt's house with my cousin. And my mum and my baby brother were next door. And one night the siren went, because this was the warning always. So the siren would go and you would know it was time to go to the shelter. But unfortunately, the siren was a bit late and a bomb dropped just down the road. Now, when a bomb drops, there's obviously a huge whoosh. And at the same time, what often happens is that windows are shattered because the air that blows out vibrates them. And this is what happened in my baby brother's bedroom. The window shattered and his bed, which was under the window, was covered in glass. But guess what? My brother was fast asleep. So when my mum got in the bedroom, she could see all this glass on him. So she had to pull back the bedclothes very carefully, lift him out, and then we went down into the shelter. But unfortunately, the shelter under the ground, as you were told, this is where he dug them, it had been raining quite a lot. And as you might imagine, sometimes water will go down into the ground. And when we got down into the shelter, it was full of water. So the water came well past our ankles. In a shelter, you often had 1 or possibly 2 little bunks, you know, like bunk beds, but just one layer of them. So we actually had to sit there for about 3 hours with our feet up on the bunk. We couldn't have our feet down because it was too wet. And during that time, I was with my mum, my nan, my uncle and aunt, the lady next door and her little daughter. And so we would sing songs, sing nursery rhymes, play little games like, you know, that game maybe, stone, paper, scissors, because you could do those sort of things just sitting. And we would do things like cat's cradles. I think we had a couple of candles, but no electric light or anything like that. And then eventually what was called the all clear would go, and it would go, you could hear it all over a town, the all clear going, and then you knew that it was safe, the planes had gone away, and you could go back into your home. And apart from, of course, there being glass all over the place, but you could clear that up.
Oh, thank you so much, Judy. That was absolutely fascinating.
So toys and games in the war. So children still needed to play and have fun even in the war years. And children have always been really good at inventing new games and finding new ways to play. Outdoor games like football and hopscotch were as popular as ever, though the children would have had to have been ready to run to the nearest air raid shelter if the alarm sounded. Even inside the shelters, people would play music, they would get out playing cards and board games and try to stay as cheerful as they possibly could.
Oh, propaganda. This is a word that we mentioned earlier. And a propaganda is the way that you use images to try and Get people to believe what you want them to believe. Now, in a wartime, propaganda is used a lot because it's important to try and get the people to get behind you, to agree with you, to do what you want them to do. And in the Second World War, it was important to get the British people to hate the people on the other side. The soldiers who were going abroad to fight needed to have the courage and the conviction to hurt and fight people on the other side. And at home, people needed to look out for spies and to be able to encourage the soldiers when they wrote to them. So this is a very clever piece of propaganda that was developed at the time. It's a paper game created to show the British people who the leader of the German people was. And this was a person who was our enemy. And it also got them to hate him by saying that he was a pig.
Brilliant, thank you, Kate. So this is the game. It's really good if you've had a go at origami or something like that before, because it's a folding game, a paper folding game. And as Kate said, the idea is to find the fifth pig, but as we see, it's not going to really be a pig at all. So what we want to do is we want to follow the lines that you can see on the page, and you can have a go at printing one of these out. You can get them on Google pretty easily, or print them out from our presentation. And what you can do is you fold it in the middle like so, okay? And then what you're going to do is you're going to just fold it in the middle. I'm making it look really easy. It's because I've done it lots of times. So I would say it is a little bit tricky to begin with, but once you get it, you get it. And can you recognise who this person is? Well done if you've said Adolf Hitler, and let's just show you a picture of him. So he was the leader of Germany and the great villain of World War II. And in fact, the war ended in Europe after his death happened. So he was somebody that they would have really wanted the children of the United Kingdom to know about. And he is the fifth pig.
And we have a piece of German propaganda here, which says Adolf Hitler ist der Sieg. Adolf Hitler is the victor. Well, in fact, Adolf Hitler wasn't the victor, but that's what the German people were being told to. And that, as you can see in that picture, he looks rather dignified, doesn't he? He looks very, very forceful and strong.
Yes, and see if you can remember the word propaganda. That's a really good word to try and remember.
So a little activity we thought you might like to try is imagine that you have been evacuated. So you've moved away from your family and your friends and the life that you know in your city. And you're now staying with a family that you've never met before in the countryside. And you might be missing your family and worried about what's happening to them while you're away, worried about the bombings. Or maybe you're like my mum and you're absolutely loving being in the countryside and having better food than you're used to. So who would you write to? Would it be a parent or a friend or brother or sister maybe, or maybe a grandparent? So have a think about what you would say, what you would tell them about.
So now is a really good time to stop if you want to ask some questions with your teacher.
And it's time for us to say goodbye. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again.
Bye-bye.